Hey, this is Jeff, and we need to talk about prisons. I've been an advocate of correctional reform since the 1980s. Recidivism rates in the U.S. are over 80%, a trend that predates the recent spike in incarceration rates by decades. The correctional system was and is utterly failing to correct criminals' behavior. There's research dating as far back as the 1960s and 70s that demonstrates effective rehabilitation is feasible. But those techniques were never implemented on a large scale, largely due to partisan politics. In an admittedly oversimplified nutshell, Republicans don't like behavior modification because it doesn't feel like vengeance, and Democrats don't like it because it reminds them of A Clockwork Orange. The reason I bring it up now is that I've heard 2020 presidential candidates discussing it. It's great that they're drawing attention to the issue, but sadly, it's not terribly surprising that their proposals miss the mark. Specifically, banning private management of prisons will do little or nothing to solve the actual problem. Privatization of the prison system really took off in the 1980s, and interestingly, recidivism rates had already plateaued around 80% by that time, and they've been more or less stable ever since. But incarceration rates skyrocketed, peaking around 2006. And yes, even though less than 10% of the people incarcerated in the United States are held in privately managed facilities, the companies managing them do have a disproportionate effect on incarceration rates. If a company makes more money by having more people locked up, of course they're going to do whatever they can to increase headcount, including lobbying to impose or increase sentences for minor offenses. But the problem isn't that the government contracts private sector companies to manage prisons. It's that the incentives in those contracts are profoundly flawed. Profit is a powerful motivator, as it should be for corporations whose reason for existence is to create value for their investors. If we stop rewarding those companies for increasing prison populations and start rewarding them for desistance, they would dust off that old research and make it happen in a heartbeat. Could we do the same thing with state-operated correctional institutions? Yes, and we should. But there are very few things that private industry can't do better and cheaper than government bureaucracies, because businesses tend to be much more nimble and willing to innovate. The fact that incarceration rates went through the roof after privatization of prison management became widespread actually supports my argument. Mass incarceration was and is the status quo, but once we started paying private companies to do it, they were better at it. So just change the contract terms to encourage rehabilitation and reintegration into society, and it seems likely that they'd be better at that too, especially since recidivism hasn't risen significantly since they got involved. It's worth mentioning here that half the people in federal prison and about a sixth of those in state prisons are there for drug offenses. It's probably not a coincidence that prison privatization, Nancy Reagan's war on drugs, and the sharp increase in incarceration rates all started around the same time. Emphasizing addiction treatment over imprisonment and decriminalizing cannabis would certainly put a dent in those numbers. But even if we granted blanket amnesty to all nonviolent drug offenders today, the U.S. would still have the world's highest incarceration rate. A real solution must include desistance for serious crimes, and it seems likely that the most effective, most cost-conscious way to accomplish that is by incentivizing the private sector to make it happen. Could I be wrong? Maybe. But doesn't it make sense to let data drive that decision, not partisan politics? Change the incentives to reward specific, measurable reductions in repeat incarceration for both state-run and private facilities and see who achieves superior results. If it's the state, give it all back to them. Let the private contracts expire and don't renew them. I strongly suspect that it would be the other way around, but like I say, let the data decide, not political ideology. Regardless of whether your primary concern is reducing crime, reducing wasteful government spending, or reducing the current system's enormous cost in human potential, this is how to address all three at the same time. What can you do about it? First off, like and share this video. Subscribe if you're interested in alternative opinions about issues where the conventional wisdom on both sides is misinformed or misguided. But more importantly, contact your elected representatives and candidates for office and tell them you're tired of sound bites that fire up the base. You want real solutions like the one I've outlined here. Anyway, that's it, and we'll talk again soon.